Or even more artificial versions of cued language switching, we tend to document or find slowdowns in processing measures as compared to staying in the same language. On the other side of all of this, we understand from sentence processing that it's thought to be incremental and predictive. So where do we situate code switching into this with these two sort of principal findings? This is something that I refer to as the code switching paradox. So just to give you a sense of the incremental and predictive processing that we know from sentence processing, I'm talking about here a very classic finding, very, in my opinion, easy to sort of understand. We see in this work from Altman and Kamide from 1999 that they use visual world eye tracking paradigm to look at the effects of verb semantics on anticipatory eye movements, which are taken to be an index of predictive processing. So in this visual scene, we see a boy who's surrounded by several objects. We see a ball, we see a cake, a toy car, and a train set. And we can compare the following two phrases. The boy will eat the cake, and the boy will move the cake. Very simple phrases, not difficult for comprehension. There's only one item that's changed between the two sentences, yet we see different eye movement patterns based on this manipulation. So with this visual scene presented here, the only plausible edible object is the cake. However, several of the objects can be moved. And as a consequence, participants show earlier eye movements to locate the cake. So in other words, they converge on the object, the cake, earlier when listening to the boy will eat the cake as compared to the boy will move the cake. And this was sort of demonstrated this predictive processing. Now, there's a very recent chapter in a new published volume on L2 processing and prediction by my colleague Edith Kahn and Therese Gruder, where they lay out a very nice review of sort of a modern take of what prediction means. So I just wanted to talk about this because I think this will help our discussion as we move forward as well. So they present in this chapter that recent discussions of prediction present essentially three lines of how we can think about prediction. One is as prediction as pre-activation, which they also refer to as a restricted view. So we can think of this as a very hard version of prediction. So in other words, we're actually thinking about the lexical features of what is about to come up. Okay, and there are some proponents of this view. We can also think about prediction as preparedness. So under this view, it's about what the potential for predictive cues to actually signal upcoming information. So we see here that context starts to play a role, and that's also the case for the sort of third view that's presented here, which is the utility of prediction. Under this view of prediction, not all things are not equal. So it always depends on the situation and the context of the moment. And so here, context can influence the state of the language processing system before bottom-up input is observed, right? They also discuss in this chapter some ongoing issues on thinking about prediction. So one of them is the relationship between prediction and integration. Following this idea of utility of prediction, the reliability of a cue, and how this is shaped by context. This might reference some very classic work like the competition model, if you're familiar with that, and the role of prediction in adaptation and learning. So with that overview, which again is a really nice chapter, so I encourage you all to look at it if you haven't already, we should be thinking about prediction in a sort of a broader sort of scheme of things, and think of it as a sort of cost-benefit analysis that the individual is undergoing. So at all times, they're sort of trying to figure out at what moment prediction is actually going to help out. So this has consequences, in my opinion, for how we think about unilingual sentence processing, whether it be in the first language or the second language, and bilingual sentence processing. So here's where the code switching comes into play. And we can make reference to some sort of recent lines of work about this this cost-benefit view of prediction. So even in monolingual speakers, we know that monolinguals engage in something known as good enough processing, which means that oftentimes we just get by with enough information and we're not sort of strongly committing to prediction. The work of Falkuti shows that there are at least some contexts or maybe some populations where prediction is not necessary. So this is especially the case when we take into account literacy. Some other work by Edith Kahn has also talked about what are the actual communicative demands and goals of the L2 parser. So under this view, even though we might not on the surface see effects of prediction in L2 processing, it might be due to the actual demands placed on the parser in that moment. And then finally, I want to just reference two other lines of work that I find very interesting when thinking about prediction. One is conversational turn taking. So this is essentially how do we know when to end our turn and when to continue a conversation. And this line of work demonstrates that we're really good at anticipating when it's okay for us to take a turn. And that seems to occur in a way that doesn't wait for the end of the sentence. So in other words, we're predicting in that moment when it's okay for the next person to speak and to intervene. And we're usually pretty good at that. And then more recently, I've been sort of made aware of this mind-wandering literature, which essentially demonstrates that at any given sort of experimental session, participants are essentially not paying attention about 40 to 60% of the time, right? So even though they might be able to successfully answer comprehension questions, so we know they're to some extent understanding, they're just not focused on the experimental stimuli that we're presenting. Of course, that has huge consequences for the type of work that we're doing. But in a way, if we think that that's a feature instead of a bug, then you can see where prediction really plays a huge role in how we understand language in the moment. So let me try to make this a little bit more concrete. I think that I need to unshare for a second to make this work. Actually, let me do it this way. All right, I know you can see this in the draft mode, but that's okay. I just want to play an audio. All right, let me know if you can't hear this audio clip. I've transcribed it from the start of this clip. It's in Spanish and English. I understand not everybody speaks Spanish here, but I think you're still going to get the point across of this bilingual exchange. And just to provide a little bit more context here, these are middle school students in Puerto Rico, and they're just meeting after school to talk about some logistics about a fundraising event, okay? Let me know if you can't hear this clip.
And that's going to include the message, o sea, quién lo vendió, el combo, todo eso. Después, I'm going to have a spreadsheet para keep track of nada, cuántos combos tenemos, who do we give it to, porque el pickup va a ser así, like, tú dices tu nombre, yo cojo la lista, ok, tú pediste un combo, toma, ¿entiendes? It's going to be like that, so...
Una conservación, básicamente.
Ajá, in order to have toda esa información, pues la esposa del papá de Alberto me va a pasar todos esos datos, and I'm just going to organize it in a spreadsheet. If you guys want, I can send it to you when it's done. Entonces nada, that's basically just to keep track of everything, all the sales, y para que cuando la gente venga, pues we can just give them out easily.
Entonces también aquí señor Paleta, no sé qué señor Paleta les iba a dar un Google Form para estos propósitos de gather the information. Yo entendía que sí, ¿verdad?
Eso estaba en el flyer que ellos le enviaron. Sí.
Sí.
Yo creo que Google Form era para los flavors, no para lo de las ventas.
Pero ¿cómo ellos van a saber quién se vendió? ¿Cuál es el deadline para el señor Paleta saber qué se vendió?
All right. Now I'm back. And I just really appreciate that clip that a friend sent me and gave me permission to share, just because of how fluid this conversation is taking place. And this is the world of Zoom. So this was a meeting over Zoom in the middle of the pandemic. And we see that the conversation is just fluid. The switches are going back and forth. Sometimes there are longer stretches in one language versus the other. There's no sort of appreciable salient pauses or hesitancies at a very grand scale before these code switches are taking place, okay? So if we think about this sort of predictive incremental parsing angle, we need to develop a framework that accounts for how bilinguals understand these switches from the comprehension side of things. How are they doing this in the moment? They might be processing this, and this might change by context as well. So it might depend on who they are speaking with, the setting that they find themselves in, and even the topic of discussion. So how do we reconcile this actual bilingual language usage with the sort of documented robust findings that we have from the lab? Again, if we look at cued-based language switching studies, these are the sort of classic types where you see pictures of items, and then by the color of the background screen, the participant is told which language they need to name the item. We see switch costs very robustly documented. We also know from the processing side of things, from the recognition side of things, that switch costs are also found, at least when compared to unilingual stimuli. Now, there is sort of a more nuanced set of findings from that literature in terms of switch costs and online processing. So while there is this sort of documented switch costs and comprehension, it does seem to be that it involves certain kinds of factors like the direction of the switch, the proficiency of the speakers, and potential other lexical factors, including grammatical category and whether it's a cognate or not, for example. Then also there's a sort of newer line of work that also demonstrates that switch costs can be attenuated by additional factors. So these are sort of these contextual cues. So this might be phonetics, some sort of phonetic cue. It might be the speaker. It might be the presentation of the stimuli. All right, so there is some nuance there. So what we are attempting to do then is to come up with an account for how this occurs online and without increasing the likelihood of what we call a garden path, or in other words, difficulty in encountering a code switch. We call this the adaptive predictability hypothesis, and there are two components to this hypothesis. So on the one hand, bilinguals are globally adapting how they predict upcoming speech based on accumulated prior experience, which includes code switch speech. Then, as far as a domain general cognitive mechanism, we're proposing that reactive cognitive control is the primary cognitive mechanism that supports rapid integration at the moment of encountering the code switch. So to understand this framework, we need to situate bilingual language usage as a highly context-driven phenomenon, and that this will be highly dependent on the varied experiences of bilinguals.
Pero no tenían el flag out there.
Just to show this again one more time as a concrete example, here I'm extracting an example from a spoken language corpus from Miami, where there's a lot of code switching that takes place. Here we see a very fluid switch that starts in Spanish, then continues into English, pero no tenían el flag out there. The problems here, when we think about this through the perspective of incremental and predictive processing, is at first, it doesn't continue in Spanish. Second, prior to the switch, in this particular example, we have a Spanish definite article that under Spanish monolingual processing would require gender agreement. And third, the gender equivalent of the Spanish translation of flag would be feminine in Spanish. So we know that there's a so-called gender congruency effect, and that when we encounter gendered articles, you essentially anticipate or restrict the possibilities of what types of nouns should follow. So it's essentially we use gender agreement in this predictive way. However, if bilingual listeners encountering this very natural code switch commit to Spanish-like processing, then the code switch utterance would actually lead to a garden path, which would require reanalysis. So that's why we came up with this adaptive prediction hypothesis. Part of what I think is going on here is that we might be too focused on interpreting switch costs as reflective of delayed processing. So part of my goal today is to demonstrate to you that instead, we should think about the series of optimal processes that bilingual listeners are engaged in, and that under certain situations, the types of prediction that might otherwise be found under monolingual contexts need to shift to accommodate the reality of how code switching takes place. All right. I also want to clarify some terminology here. So my own reading from the literature is that when we talk about switch costs, it's actually a really ambiguous term, and that different researchers are referring to different items, to different aspects. So I want to break this up into two pieces, in fact. On the one hand, I want to talk about the predictive side, so everything leading up to when the code switch can occur. And then I want to talk about the integration side. So what happens once you've actually encountered the code switch? And I think these two components that we've proposed in the adaptive prediction hypothesis talk about both of these angles. So the adaptive prediction part, which in other ways I'm describing as learning when to go all in or when to hold off, is actually focused on this predictive processing side. It requires more proactive control. And the reactive control is focused on the rapid integration side. Okay? And so these are sort of two moving pieces that we need to take into account while we're talking about code switching. So I want to illustrate this with some prior work in our group, hopefully to convince you that we're thinking about this in the right way. On the adaptive prediction side, as I mentioned, I'm thinking about this as sort of a cost-benefit analysis as to when listeners should commit fully to predicting and go all in versus when they should actually hold off, because prediction in that moment would actually increase likelihood of garden paths. Listeners in general, but bilingual listeners as well, are attuned to linguistic cues in different ways, and that this should sort of all lead to these shifts of learning when to actively predict versus when to hold off. On the active prediction side, we might think of phonetic phonological cues as likely candidates for predictive cues. Also, prior work demonstrates that priming might also play a role here, whether it be lexical or syntactic. But the adaptive prediction and sort of making a trade-off as to when to suspend that prediction is actually a behavior that's optimal. It actually leads to better preparation for the comprehension system for a possible but not certain code switch. So the intention to delay prediction becomes efficient parsing in order to avoid disruptive garden paths. I'm going to illustrate this very quickly with some work that Alex referenced earlier about grammatical gender and Spanish-English code switching. I always provide the caveat that I'm talking about Spanish-English bilinguals along the East Coast of the United States, including Puerto Rico. There does seem to be some indication that the way that gender interacts in code switching may look different in other communities across the United States and other parts of the Spanish-English speaking world. So in 2016, we conducted a very simple corpus analysis, just trying to understand what gender looks like in these Spanish determiner English nouns type switches. We also counted the English determiner to Spanish nouns. And we used that Bangor, Miami spoken English, Spanish-English corpus. And the distribution is very, very striking. Essentially, these bilinguals overwhelmingly prefer to start with a Spanish masculine article and then continue into the English noun, okay? There are instances of feminine marked Spanish articles, then going into English nouns. And there's another sort of asymmetry that happens here. Of these mixed switches here, the English noun is feminine when translated into Spanish, okay? This is sort of restrictively so. But in the masculine case, it's not. Right? So we find instances in which the English noun can either be masculine or feminine in Spanish. So we have an asymmetry of how gender is playing a role here in Spanish-English code switching. It's something that doesn't look completely English-like nor completely Spanish-like. And this asymmetry that we documented in production was reflected in comprehension. The way that we studied this was with the visual world study, so very similar to that Altman and Kamida design. It was even simpler, actually. So we essentially just presented two objects to the participants, and either the two objects belonged to the same gender class in Spanish or they did not. And prior work had demonstrated very, very robustly in very young children and adults that in the different gender contexts, once you hear the article, participants start to launch anticipatory eye movements towards the target item. So in other words, the gender is informative and listeners are using this in a predictive way. Okay, this is the case of Spanish monolinguals. However, as I just mentioned in code switching, that sort of prediction would not help out because the masculine doesn't necessarily predict only masculine objects, right? And we demonstrated that in code switching. So that was the purpose of that study, but I'm not going to show you those results because something else happened, which is way more relevant for our discussion. So if you're interested in those graphs, I have them so I can show you at the end. But I want to talk about what happened in the Spanish blocks. So what happened when the participants were listening to Spanish? Here, I'm just going to demonstrate that the monolinguals show this gender anticipatory effect. So first, I'm just showing results from Spanish monolinguals. Again, the items were either matched to be from the same gender class or from different gender classes. And we looked at this whether the determiner was feminine or masculine in Spanish. These are somewhat complex graphs, but essentially what you're seeing is eye movements towards the target item presented in orange. These are the Spanish monolinguals. And you see that for the masculine determiners, when they hear the masculine determiner target and it's paired with an object that's also masculine, that sort of the separation between the orange and blue line takes place much later than in the context in which that target item occurs with a different gendered item. So this is a demonstration of prediction or an anticipatory eye movement, right? So they're using masculine to predict the upcoming noun. We see, however, that the bilingual participants don't do this in Spanish, okay? For Spanish masculine items. So here you see that the time course is essentially the same, whether it be same gendered items or different gendered items, all right? And they didn't do this for the feminine, okay? So the feminine, both the monolinguals and bilinguals continued showing this anticipatory effect. So it was very specific to what the bilinguals did with masculine. Okay, so just to say that one more time, in contrast to the Spanish monolinguals, bilinguals don't show an anticipatory effect for just the masculine conditions. They do so for the feminine conditions, which is the graph I did not show. And the other graph I did not show is that the bilinguals show the same asymmetry of just using feminine in a predictive way in the code switching context as well. Now, one of the sort of interpretations of these findings, which we got in our feedback oftentimes was, well, this might be a sign of attrition. This might be a sign that the bilinguals are no longer, are using masculine as a default strategy, even in the Spanish monolingual context. At least one of the reasons why I don't think that's the case is because at least, with a post hoc naming study, gender is intact. So the idea is that they're still able to access this knowledge of what the gender of these items are. This is not a hard task. It's about what they're doing in processing. So while on the surface, this seems to be a negative consequence, right? It seems to be the case that they are stopping, they're no longer doing something that monolinguals do. I want to flip that interpretation completely around and suggest that this is actually the best outcome for these bilingual listeners. Remember that because masculine can either be followed by a Spanish masculine noun, an English noun that's masculine in Spanish, or an English noun that's feminine in Spanish, there is going to be at least some situation in which predicting Spanish masculine objects following Spanish masculine nouns will actually provoke a garden path, right? And a need for reanalysis. So the interpretation here then is that the bilinguals have calculated this cost-benefit analysis, have shifted what they do with predictive cues in a way that actually helps them better prepare for the switch and the likelihood that it occurs. So in other words, this is a trade-off. They give up active prediction in order to better prepare and avoid a disruptive garden path, okay? So let's talk about the reactive control side of things with integration of the code switch itself. Here we're going to suggest that cognitive control plays a useful role for overriding expectations that things will continue in the same language. This idea comes from a theoretical framework that my colleague Jared Novick proposed with colleagues back in 2005, where basically the idea is that cognitive control helps speakers avoid garden paths because domain general cognitive control is thought to resolve conflicting representations and also helps to override prepotent responses. There's some converging evidence here, neural evidence of increased activation and LIFG, left inferior frontal gyrus, which is presumably one of the neural areas implicated in this cognitive control network. Converging evidence from patients with aphasia with damage to LIFG. And what I'm going to focus on, evidence from cross-task conflict adaptation. Because code switches potentially introduce conflict at the moment of the switch, cognitive control may also aid in rapid integration. That's the hypothesis. So we're working, this paradigm relies upon a premise known as conflict adaptation. The idea behind conflict adaptation is that if you've just encountered something hard that requires cognitive control, an immediately following item that also requires cognitive control is going to be slightly more efficient, slightly more easier, because you've just deployed cognitive control. So there's essentially a spillover effect, and this is known as conflict adaptation, right? What we're going to do then is test this in a cross-task fashion by looking at processing of unilingual and code switch speech with flanker trials. And we chose flanker because this is a classic psychological task that demonstrates the use of cognitive control. Flanker trials are a series of arrows. We're going to see them in a second, in which you need to pay attention to the central arrow. When that central arrow is in the opposite direction of the rest of the arrows, that's known as an incongruent trial, and people are slower to respond and have more errors as compared to when the arrows are all pointing in the same direction. So what we did then is pseudo-randomly designed sequences of self-paced reading of unilingual versus code-switched sentences with these flanker congruent versus incongruent trials. And here, the sequences could be from flanker to flanker, flanker to self-paced reading to self-paced reading, or self-paced reading to flanker. And this last sequence is the critical sequence that we care about. The prediction then, if our hypothesis, if there's corroborating evidence for our hypothesis, is that having just read code-switched text will lead to improved performance on incongruent flanker trials. In other words, faster reaction time, and that would support our hypothesis. So here's a visual of this paradigm again. We're going to be looking at measures of flanker, right? So they're going to be performing reaction time to responding to which direction the central arrow is pointed. But we critically want to look at this as a function of what they did just beforehand, okay? And again, conflict adaptation would suggest that if code switching does lead to increased cognitive control, then reaction time on this incongruent trial should be faster than this incongruent trial, okay? Here we tested 48 Spanish-English bilinguals. The unilingual sentences were blocked by languages in a between group design. So in other words, they either saw English sentences or Spanish unilingual sentences, but between groups. And the code switches occurred at various points in the sentence at what have been considered grammatical switch points. And we did control for a series of lexical variables, and we did have comprehension questions to make sure that they were paying attention. And just as a sort of sanity check, we see that the reaction time to flanker trials does confirm this flanker effect. So in other words, people are slower to respond to incongruent trials than congruent trials. But critically, we want to look at how this effect is modulated by the preceding language of the sentence. And so we're looking for an interaction effect, and that's precisely what we found. So whether the sentence was code switched or not had no effect on performance on the congruent flanker trials, but it did on the incongruent trials and in the direction that we predicted. So after having read a code switch sentence, these participants were faster on the incongruent flanker trial. This is demonstrating then this conflict adaptation effect. So having just processed a code switch sentence leads to a faster response time on an immediately following incongruent flanker trial. And this suggests that code switching leads to immediate cognitive control engagement. The integration of code switches in real time then may lead to measurable switch costs, right? Returning to this sort of lab-based findings and trying to reconcile this typical effect. But it might be in the service of avoiding costlier garden paths and also as a reflection of engaging with cognitive control at the site of integration. So with these two pieces then, code switches may lead to harder integration, but maybe instead of considering harder as defective or delayed or difficult, we might want to suggest that this is actually skillful. So we should return to asking ourselves, why do speakers code switch to begin with? And this might require us then to not just focus on what the switch cost does, but what is it that the listener gains from the code switch downstream? And so I want to end with the work of Alex, because this is certainly a part of this bigger grand scheme of the way that I'm thinking about prediction, adaptation, and code switching. And so this is a recently published paper looking at the role of code switching itself as a predictive cue for something that's about to come up later in the sentence. This is greatly inspired by information theory, essentially from sociolinguistic and corpus-based studies showing that switches tend to occur before less frequently used or more salient languages, and also tends to encode less predictable or highly informative content as measured by surprisal. Similarly, sociolinguists have documented several sociopragmatic functions for code switching, among them that CS leads to frequently used, CS is associated with, for example, highly emotive content or taboo content, which is another form of less predictive meaning. So what we saw here was a parallel with another literature related to disfluencies and its relationship to online processing. Now, let me be extremely clear that I'm not in any way associating code switch speech with disfluent speech, but I'm looking at the way in which code switching can impact processing. And here, this is the parallel that I want to draw with disfluencies in online processing. So I'm just going to show a quick example, but essentially the takeaway is that at least in monolingual speakers and hearing monolingual speech, that disfluent instructions lead to expecting less expected or unfamiliar items earlier on. So in other words, the disfluency is actually signaling something that's upcoming. So the way that this was established, here we see a visual world design again. In this case, we have 4 objects, and essentially participants either heard fluent instructions, now put the whatever, versus now put the whatever, and this was considered the disfluent condition. And context was established such that the target was either a given item or a new item. I want you to sort of pay attention to this diagonal that I have in red here. Notice that there's this sort of bump of sort of earlier looks to whatever the competitor is, but it's the opposite based on whether it's the fluent condition or the disfluent condition, okay? So when it's the fluent condition and the target item is new, participants have a sort of anticipatory looks to look at the given item, okay? However, when the instructions were disfluent and the target was given, participants were drawn to look at the new item. So the interpretation here is that when participants heard the disfluent speech, they were more likely to expect that the participant was about to name a new item versus a given item. So in other words, they've associated a sociopragmatic function to disfluencies, again, with monolingual speakers and in monolingual speech. We want to lay out that exact same hypothesis with code switching. Will code switching then bias bilingual listeners to expect something that's less predictable downstream, okay? So in other words, we call this predicting the unexpected. And we're going to index this by increased earlier looks to the less predictable item after hearing a code switch. In this case, we're operationalizing prediction, or excuse me, as predictability, as lexical frequency. There are many directions in which this work can and will take, but this is sort of the first step in this direction. And we have just two items paired together, and you're going to see the design again. So you see here, we have a bridge. This would be considered the higher frequency item, and a picture of the moose, which in US English would be low frequency. I recognize that context always matters in these types of designs. And again, they would either hear Spanish instructions or code switched instructions. Those recordings were produced by a highly proficient bilingual speaker of Puerto Rican Spanish English. And the positions of the panels were actually randomized, pseudo-randomized, so that it was never predictable where the two items would occur in this design. One very important feature of this design is that the code switches occur several words before the actual target onset of the item to be named. So this would allow us to separate the effect of the code switch and examining anticipatory effects from any potential switch costs that might occur at the switch itself. Okay, and again, what we're looking for here is if code switching is signaling something to the bilingual listener, then the bilingual will expect lower frequency items after hearing the code switch as compared to continuing in the same language. For this study, we had 30 Spanish-English bilingual participants. They did vary on several measures, which we'll talk about in a second. And here we're looking at the proportion of looks to the proportion of looks to the items based on frequency. So whether it was a high frequency or low frequency item. Here are the proportion of looks on the y-axis. And then on time, the 0 mark here is the target onset. But you should always sort of calculate an additional 150 to 200 milliseconds here for the effects of the onset to actually affect eye movements, okay? So this gray section here is the analysis window that we're going to look at. But already with this graph here, you should see that essentially the looks to high frequency versus low frequency are completely flipped, whether they're code switched or in Spanish only. Okay, so we confirm that with a statistical analysis here with growth curve analyses. Again, here you see that the colors are completely flipped. In the case of Spanish, the participants, when hearing Spanish instructions, are more likely to start looking at the high frequency item. But when they heard the code switch, they were more likely to look at the low frequency item. So that seemed to confirm our hypothesis. We did have a bidominance interaction as well, which is interesting. But the sort of takeaway from that bidominance interaction is that for the code switches, whether somebody was less dominant or more dominant in English or Spanish, either way, they're still looking at the lower frequency item after hearing code switches. Where it seemed to matter was in the Spanish conditions. So you see here that the Spanish dominant speakers were more likely to show a high frequency bias. So this is typically what we find in monolingual speakers, but the English dominant speakers didn't show that high frequency bias, okay? So with that illustration, we're showing that the bilingual listeners are attuned to this sort of sociopragmatic function of code switching. So what they're hearing is actually going to be interpreted to guide them as to what's coming up in the speech. So processing a code switch led to bilinguals anticipating a lower frequency item. This is particularly interesting and revealing given that there is typically a very strong frequency bias when you have these sort of frequency disparities between two objects. People tend to look at higher frequency objects in unilingual processing. So despite, again, these potentials for integration costs associated with code switching, the code switch itself can lead to a facilitatory cue downstream in processing, thus leading to processing benefits. So the listeners are doing something with the code switch. So I'm going to wrap up here. The adaptive predictability hypothesis then attempts to resolve how bilinguals comprehenders avoid disruptive garden paths and integrate code switches in real-time processing. Bilinguals learn to adapt how they predict in sentence processing as a consequence of the exposure that they have and the context that they find themselves in typical bilingual language usage. So this can lead to shifts in predictive processing in order to best serve their interests so that they can avoid garden paths, costly garden paths. At the same time, we're going to rely upon a domain general mechanism of cognitive control to help integrate code switches in the moment when they are encountered. And then finally, pursuing a newer line of research for us, we're shifting our focus from just looking at what happens at the code switch to how people interpret code switches in online processing. So in this case, the code switch itself can act as a signal for upcoming unexpected content. There are some issues to work out here with this framework. So I just want to mention some, and obviously I'd be very grateful for your comments here. I'm looking for parallels here with a similar sort of adaptive effect happening under context of unilingual processing. Here we might think about maybe anti-locality effects as being one possible avenue for exploring this parallel. I think we need a better understanding of the transmission of code switching between adults and children. So I do think there's some work that addresses this. However, I think we need to be very careful with claiming that the ways that children engage with mixing between their languages carry the whole set of features that adults do when they're engaging with code switching. I think there's a tension that we find between different kinds of cues as to whether they actively predict anticipation of a code switch versus this delayed prediction that I've talked about. So I think we need to have this better understanding of a relationship between those two pieces. And finally, I do believe that there are differential demands placed on the production and comprehension of code switch speech, but we need some more clarity there as well. Finally, we do have a new open access series. Well, it's 2 years old now. That's through Language Science Press. So I would like to encourage you all to submit your proposals. We are asking for proposals from monographs and edited volumes. This series is known as Current Issues in Bilingualism. And one of the great things about Language Science Press is that it's fully open access with no cost to the author or the reader. So I just wanted to sort of mention that. This is our first volume on code switching, as it turns out. And we've also just published our second volume with several more in the pipeline. So thank you very much. And yes, I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
I'm transferring all the virtual applauses. Oh, okay, we have a question right away from Jason. So yeah, I'll just open the floor for any questions. Thank you so much for Jorge for that. Jason.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Yeah, so thanks, Jorge. You know, as usual, very impressive. So really wonderful stuff, and really like this stuff. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'll try to limit myself to one and then shut up. And if there's time, maybe come back to a couple. So maybe I'll work backwards, or I can integrate some of them. So I wonder, in the last study that you just went over with us, if you thought about, or if you did, I imagine if you did, you would have showed us, but if you thought about directionality of the languages themselves, right? So I wonder if you would get similar effects if you were to start with Spanish and then look into English, because I wonder, and I think it's, you know, if it's the truth, it's the truth. But I think, you know, a cynical interpretation of what you show could be that, well, what underlies code switching in these contexts is really lack of knowledge of particular words. So what you're doing is you're avoiding, and therefore you're switching. You can't really be predictive, so you go to low frequency because it's much more likely that the low frequency words are going to be the words that bilinguals don't know, and therefore you're getting at something. And of course, you know, that might be true. And if it's true, that's fine. But that's not necessarily the message we want to state if we don't know that that's really what it is. So I think if you look in the opposite direction, you can make either similar or distinct predictions that could enlighten that view. I'd like to hear what you say. And then I have more. Anyway.
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for that question, Jason. And of course, very much looking forward to multiple conversations about this anytime. So first, I'll just say, sorry for my lack of clarity, that these code switches were Spanish to English. And in fact, that was an important design feature for us, because since we are trying to be very loyal to the code switching practices of the community that we're studying, one of these sort of documented sort of sociolinguistic observations with how code switching takes place, especially in the context of majority minority language settings, is that the switches tend to take place from the minority language into the majority language. So that's why, even though from sort of a controlled design feature, we usually place greater emphasis in our studies with the Spanish to English switch compared to the English to Spanish switch. Let me bookmark that for a second. And that's because that's the typical switch direction of the bilinguals in the US, regardless of whether they're more English or more Spanish dominant. That tends to be the case, okay? Now, as far as whether this is in part due to lack of knowledge or maybe just lack of access in the moment, that's absolutely one of the functions of code switching, right? So there is a lexical access part of this. It's just not the only one, right? And so here's where this parallel with disfluency can be really helpful. So if monolinguals are disfluent, I mean, that's fine. It's not because they don't know what's coming up, right? It's just that in that moment, there probably was some sort of lexical access issue going on. What I think is more important is the takeaway of what the listener does with that information, right? They're attributing an interpretation in that moment. And I think that's a very sort of fine-tuned sort of understanding of this pragmatic thing that's going on. So the fact that these listeners in this very constrained experiment were sort of able to sort of anticipate lower frequency items, regardless of whether it ended up being actually the lower frequency item that was named, just by associating it with the code switch, just to me highlights this one of these functions of code switches. We can take this in many other directions, and I want to, but this was our first step here. So my prediction from the get-go, though, is that if we looked at English to Spanish switching, that we might not see this frequency effect, because that's just not a typical switch pattern for our bilinguals. But that's to be determined.
Yeah, I mean, the ecological validity is, fantastic, and I get it, but, that doesn't mean they wouldn't probably be able to do it in the opposite direction. And so that might reveal some knowledge that they have. And then you can say, it's not that they don't know it, it's really a retrieval over a knowledge type of problem in that particular context. And one function, as you said, of code switching in terms of those momentary retrieval situations in that particular context. I think unrelatedly, I'll ask one more question and then I will shut up, but I have many more. I might send them to you. I wonder if something that you might be interested in doing is, and I think, basically what you show is fantastic, and you need the narrative to put it together of something that is not rather obvious, it's always obvious in hindsight, right? Which is, if something doesn't give you sub-Q validity, then you can't really use it for prediction in the first place, right? And that's basically what you're showing here. And you're saying, okay, so the masculine article, it just doesn't really have any Q validity for them that's of predictive value. And so therefore that's shut off, right? Okay, fantastic, that makes sense. And I'd love to probe your brain later though, about why you think that's the good candidate. I have some linguistic reasons for which, and I'm sure you probably agree with them. If not, we can discuss it. But
I agree with them.
But that aside, I wonder if it would be equally interesting for you to take, let's say, monolinguals and put them in a context, and then learn from that to do something with bilinguals as a start, but put them in a context in which you remove, so you can see how adaptive, how reactive and proactive, how reactive this is. If you remove the Q validity by either giving them native speech that somehow just makes all of these errors, surprisingly, if it sounds native otherwise to them, or put them in a foreign language, have them speak to me for 20 minutes, and then see if they're still able, or if they shut it off, and that wouldn't tell us See, in that context, we would know they have it. And you said the bilinguals have it anyway, but they really have it, but it's of no value. It's of no predictive value in the present context. And it would show you the reactivity to it. In a different sense for your bilinguals, it's this cumulative experience that they don't even start turning it on. So if you show that in monolinguals, and I think you will, then the question becomes, if the underlying knowledge is there, how could you potentially think experimentally how you could turn it on for the bilinguals, right? And that would be, if you put them in a context in which this validity is really, really mapped, how long would it take for this correspondence, and ease the burden in the environment for, say, promoting lexical retrieval by using some lexical priming and whatever. And would you expect, and I think you would, that if the knowledge of that feeds into prediction, that's the linguistic knowledge, is there, if you can turn it off with the monolinguals, you probably can turn it on with the bilinguals. I want you to comment on that, and then we'll let everybody else.
Yeah, sure. So you've essentially described the next 5 years of my research. So we are thinking very much of this, just as sort of an initial pass. I'm sure you're aware of this recent work with Edith, where we just paired monolinguals and bilinguals in an RP study with code switches, and lo and behold, once the bilinguals with a monolingual, the code switches get way harder for them. So there is this, there's something about this context effect and what people are doing in the moment and interpreting the cue validity, right? We're also exploring the effect of accent on code switching. This is one of those pandemic paused projects, essentially determining whether the listener indexes the speaker that they listen to sort of determine what they do with code switching, which is another way of getting at this cue validity. And then finally, the next line of new work is looking at attention in code switching. So this is sort of related to this mind-wandering type literature that I mentioned. So that's work with the Maryland crew that I work with. And we want to place monolinguals in that situation and see what happens, essentially for the reasons that you state. So yeah, no, we're very, very in tune with these ideas, and this is the next set of work that we hope to carry out.
Great. I mean, it's really fantastic. It really is. I can't wait to see all of that then. So yeah,
thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jorge. This is so exciting. And well, I mean, I have, again, so many questions and comments, but I actually wanted to pick your brain, So basically, I'm currently developing a project with Jason and Ele to try to continue understanding what's behind the variability in learning trajectories and outcomes among heritage bilinguals, right? So we're going to be focusing on morphosyntax, and we're going to be looking at processing and with ERPs actually in Florida, right? So we know that like how much you engage with your languages, right, has an effect on how well you process them, the level of representation, and all of that. But I've been wondering for a long time now that is not only how much you engage, but also how you engage with them, right? So now we have our design finalized. I'm going to start piloting the study next week. Hopefully we'll be collecting data soon there in Florida. But now I've been thinking for a while now that I think we need to have some form of behavioral measure of switching, right? How people engage with switching, especially since we know that the Spanish-speaking community in the US does engage with code switching. This is something inherently inherent, I think, from the heritage bilingual experience. I'm familiar with a set of different questionnaires to try to tap into how people engage with the languages and how much they switch and or in what context they switch. But I was wondering if you have anything that you would recommend that it's kind of a quick and dirty measure, if you may allow me, that we could add to our already, the measures that we already have, so then we could kind of get a little bit of understanding of what is that they're doing in terms of like how much they engage, but how they engage.
Yeah. Thank you, Alicia. Sorry, let me drink some water. I'll be right back.
Thank you.
Okay, so yes, I would suggest that you look at Angelique Blackburn's SEXY survey. I don't know if you've heard of this one. It's spelled SACSE. This is all about code switching, and it's very well validated, and it's open, just for public use. So you can ask me for that reference later.
Awesome.
I also recently found out about a similar type of survey that's about quantifying code switching experience for US bilinguals from Dan Olson from Purdue. He just presented this work, and also I think that could be another viable option. So those are for code switching itself. But I actually would also just suggest that you go down the entropy route that Jason Gullifer has proposed, because I think it's not just about, you know, how much it's not just about finding out whether we code switch or not, but it's about sort of having some sort of capture of a measure that really teases apart how compartmentalized our languages are, right? So how much are we blocking off the use of our two languages between actually going in sort of this more sort of fluid use of both languages, maybe even independent of code switching. So that would be my suggestion. But yeah, obviously you have some logistics to figure out as well. You can't do it all.
Yeah, thank you. That's awesome that you mentioned that, because we're definitely looking into entropy and also some form of like trying to capture their social network. But I think maybe a couple of questions to try to capture also how much they're engaging in switching would be nice. Well, thank you, and hopefully we'll be seeing you soon in person.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, Vince, you can just go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll just join everyone else, Jorge, in saying thanks a bunch for that really interesting talk. And one of the things that really struck me was the bit you'd mentioned about code switching determining some, the post-conflict slowing or speeding up effects. Mm-hmm. As I understand it, and I kind of wanted to extend what you might think for other populations a bit further. So as I understand it, the participants who were in this typically would code switch on a pretty regular basis. They have pretty integrated language context. If you were to give that same experiment to, say, people living in Norway, for example, where there's still access to both languages, but switching is on a societal level potentially a little less than you'd necessarily expect to find it in the States, how would you imagine results might pattern? Would you expect to see similar things, or would you expect that?
Thank you very much, Vince. That is always a very important question in my opinion. And we did do this. So we have a 2018 paper that looks at the code switching. It's the eye tracking study with the gender and the code switching. We did this between bilinguals who don't code switch and bilinguals who are habitual code switchers. And at least in the context of that eye tracking experiment, let's just say that it obliterated their ability to parse these sentences. So in other words, not only did they not show the asymmetry that we documented with the US bilinguals, but they actually absolutely stopped using gender predictively in any way whatsoever, even though they were Spanish dominant. So these were people who were Spanish English bilinguals in Spain, and just code switching was such, in the way that we presented, was such a unusual way of language use that just, if you look at the eye track, it's almost like flat lines. Like they absolutely didn't know what to do. It just overwhelmed the system for them. So I think, that speaks to this sort of experience part of this, at least for processing. I mean, it's definitely true that bilinguals are very sensitive to what types of grammatical categories can participate in code switching. That's very well documented. But on the processing side, there seems to be this extra layer as to how people are able to use that knowledge in online processing. And that does seem to be based to how exposed people are to this type of use of language.
Very nice. Great, thank you.
Hi, Jorge. Thank you so much. This is really, really nice. I have a small question about the part of your talk where you talked about cognitive control and the intermeeting language and styles. And I was curious to ask you to elaborate a bit more, like what component of cognitive control do you think the switch elicits? Like, is it more like attentional, such that related to what you were talking about later, that it prepares you to pay attention? And in a sense, maybe you even expect an incongruent trial more so than the congruent one? Or is it like the resolution or the inhibition?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So this, I will have to rely on the work of my colleague, Jared Novick, because he's definitely the expert here. And he has done the version of the experiment that tries to tease apart inhibitory control from attentional control. And not with code switches, but it's the same sort of type of logic. So with garden paths, at least with garden path sentences and the non-linguistic sort of control tasks, attention does not lead to conflict adaptation in the way that inhibitory control does. So at least based on that experiment, the locus would be inhibitory control and not attentional control. Okay.
Thank you.
So hopefully that's convincing, but you know, it's not specific to code switching. We don't know for code switching.
Right. But thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Jason has a follow-up.
Yeah, you know, it's let me put my hand down because it distracts me, except I never know. Okay, there we go. Okay, so just in a sense, this is almost, it's also following up on what Alicia had asked and you, Jorge, and whatever. And I just want to make sure that I also have things clear, right, in terms of the scope or the remit of what your claims are and what you're really actually trying to do. So, you know, you're looking here, the claims I think you're making are specific to prediction, right? And so they're relevant when you're looking at prediction, right? Because, you know, I'm trying to think of a hypothesis and I don't want to extend beyond, you know, when you show something, it doesn't necessarily apply everywhere, right? So, you know, if I understood your data correctly, right, you're not making any suggestion whatsoever that there is a difference, that you don't have a representation of gender, right, or that gender representation at all is affected, right? So would it follow then that if you're looking at something in a unilingual modality, and you're not looking at gender in a predictive way, that you're expecting the typical reactions dependent on the methodology, whether it's eye tracking, whether it's ERP, to not be affected by, let's say, some type of code switching measure. Is that correct?
Almost. I mean, I think there is a potential, say, for example, if, I mean, I think this goes back to, let me leapfrog a second and then I'll come back. I think what you're asking is very much related to the, let's call it the time course of whatever this effect is, right? So the way in which I think that there could be an effect here, Jason, that might affect what you're trying to look at is if, for example, you start talking to the participant totally in English at the beginning of the experiment, and then you want to test them in Spanish, right? So, so we don't know where the decay is to these sets of sort of these contextual cues and how we're
yeah, of course,
you know.
of course.
So I think that's the way that
when we do unilingual things, we do everything is unilingual. You know, I think from your data there is something, and I actually was I was predicting and it was wrong, because what I thought you were going to say from your own data is that you show that even in a unilingual mode, that the bilinguals are different from the monolinguals in terms of the relative time course of their disambiguation, right? That was with masculine, they showed the effect and they looked to the right picture eventually, but you know, this disambiguation happens later, right? So
that is what I'm saying, by the way. I think we're on the same page, at least for the masculine. Okay.
So you might find in a unilingual mode that there is some attenuation, or, you know, at whatever degree, let's say if we're interested in ERP, that there might be some difference in terms of the quality of the signature, but you wouldn't expect the signature itself to be different, right? So let's say the amplitude would be attenuated or something like that, right? So, you know, that's important for me to just keep in mind. You know, in our, we have to make choices, as we all know, in terms of what we can collect and what is really forming the basis and the part of the hypothesis or not. And I want to make sure that I understood what you're saying to say where this is crucial and where this is potentially something that is less crucial.
Let me just say one more thing that I think might also add to this, which is we see these types of things under monolingual contexts and monolingual speakers as well. So, for example, I really like this work that Holger Hopp published, I believe in 2016, which was essentially once you start introducing gender mismatches to monolingual German speakers, by the end of the experiment, they stop predicting with gender. I mean, it makes total sense, right? But in other words, it's this ability to shift based on what they're getting in the moment. So just wanted to add that. So this is something that can occur under monolingual context as well.
Yeah, actually, it's Holger's work in mind why I asked you what I asked you in the first place, because meaning back to my original question, right? Because we know that can happen in short time course, right? So, yeah. All right, thank you. Thanks.
Do we have time for like a little thing that I just wanted to follow up with Jorge on?
I do.
Okay, just like a silly thing that you just said, but that make me really think. So, you know, like in my experience in the context of the US, right? When I work with like heritage bilinguals, and the thing of the unilingual language mode, to me, it's something so paradigmatic because you reach out to these people in English. At least that's been my experience. You recruit sending a blast email to classes or whatever. You go to their classes and you kind of walk in and you speak English and you switch in Spanish and you go back and forth and then you switch in English again. So almost even if the participants recognize you, they know kind of, I mean, still English tends to be kind of the dominant language or the predominant language of the communication, right? Then you bring them into the lab, and at least in my experience, even if you want to try to make it as kind of like unilingual mode as you can, and you want to now prime them and have their Spanish count somewhat more activated, there's a previous experience and relationship that's happened before, right? And often, and I have to be honest with my research, the instructions of all the tasks, cognitive and linguistic, tend to be in English, right? Even though if you're later testing them in Spanish. So I've always wondered what the effect of all of these things have and how we can actually promote more ecological validity in the stuff that we do, right? But it is kind of tricky because on the one hand, you want to make sure that the participant is understanding exactly what they need to do. So I've always wondered, should we have the instructions both in the dominant and the non-dominant language? Should we switch when we go through, you know, like the task with them? How should we present ourselves? And these are kind of almost existential questions that I have as a researcher, right? And even more so when we're talking about, you know, like this context when there's like a minority language or minority-sized language and the dominant majority language, right? And this is specifically relevant for the type of research that we're trying to do. And I don't know, like if you have some, I'm sure you have so much insight and wisdom to share here. I wanted to hear what you think.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. I mean, I don't want to present myself as the expert with these kinds of questions or issues, but I think the way that I think about it is, you know, if you can, you should. So in other words, to the extent that you can establish a relationship and sort of indicate that you are sort of part of this group of code switchers, or if that's what you're interested in, or, you know, if you're focused on the Spanish part, your ability to convey that that's what, that's the relationship that you're trying to establish. If you can, you should. That's all, you know, so if that involves hiring an RA that sort of matches the community, speaking to these, establishing the common ground of what language you're going to be interacting with these participants, I think all of that can be helpful. Now, to what extent, I have no idea. I mean, some things that we have tried to do is we engage with sort of this conversation task that we have, where we just make participants kind of play this referential communication game before the main experiment, as a way to establish common ground with language use. That might be one way to help. But at the same time, I mean, my understanding of the classic work that Viorica did with the bilingual visual world work was that they tried to do this very like Russian room and get, you know, they had tea available, you know, they did all this stuff that was culturally relevant to welcoming the participants, and apparently it didn't matter. So, I mean, I just don't know, but, you know, again, if you can, you should. That's basically the dictum that I would go by.
Thank you. Super interesting.
All right. Thank you all for a very fruitful discussion. Any last minute questions?
I don't have a question, but can I make a comment?
Absolutely.
I think, you know, I too am not going to presume that I should be the person to answer this question, at least because I wasn't asked, but I'm still going to offer my opinion. I just want to add to this that I think, and I hope you would agree, Jorge, I think it very much depends on your questions. And these are very important decisions that you have to weigh the options of. And there's no direct answer, I think, is what Jorge, or there's no one catch-all answer. But you really have to think about the relative weight and importance given specifically what you're looking at. So in the context, right, bilinguals are many things, right? Especially, let's take the example we all know very well, which is Hispanics in the United States. They are code switchers, right? And so if you're looking at code switching, it's very important that they understand that that's an acceptable thing in the context of what you're doing right now. But they are also, whether that's their most natural state, when they go and talk to grandma, they are also potentially in monolingual modes, and they are also in English monolingual modes. And so if your goal is to be looking at, whether that's right or not to do, but if your stated goal is to look at what their Spanish looks like, not what their Spanish looks like in the context of when they're engaged primarily heavily in code switching, then I would argue for you in that context, you want to create a context in which you reduce that variable as much as possible in that context, because your claims are going to be about what their gender assignments and their agreeing system is in that monolingual mode of Spanish, which does exist for them, right? So yes, it's true that, I mean, I was in Florida for a long time too. And yes, every heritage speaker I came in contact with, God bless every one of them, was a prolific code switcher. That said, all the ones I had direct relationships with, grandma called, they were prolific monolingual moders as well. And if that's the domain that you're looking at, the answer to Alicia's question is potentially very different in the context of what Jorge is doing, as opposed to what we may be doing, or if we're just looking at their English or whatever, we want to reduce those variables. So I think it's very important to think about those things, but it's impossible to offer an answer, but you want to look at the context in which you're looking at something. So hence my question of saying, yes, if we had all the time in the world, all that information, because lest there be a difference that we can't explain, and you come to me that, damn it, I bet it's code switching behavior, and if we had it, yeah. But at the same time, we want to think about, well, in this context, we are talking about Spanish, and we could actually use Jorge's work that he showed us to say, okay, maybe for what we're looking at it, we might not need that. I don't know, right? But I think that can be now transposed to any context in which you're doing things. What aspect of individuals' bilingualism are you looking at in a linguistic sense? And then prejudicing yourself to be in the best case to not introduce inadvertently noise, right? In that context. Accepting that noise is part of the bilingual issue that we're shifting through all the time, right? I don't know if you agree with that, Jorge, or not, but I wanted to leave that there as well.
Totally agree. No, that's very well put.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm also very curious as to how that all relates with like representation and processing with the heritage bilinguals, and for example, clitics in Bosnian, Norwegian bilinguals, and if maybe they're more sensitive to misplacement of clitics when they are in this monolingual context versus a bilingual context. But yeah, thank you very much for the comments. We have a question from either Janina or Elle.
Yeah, super quick, because I know we are trying to wrap up. So you know, I was thinking about what you said, Jorge, when you showed that sentence with the two types of errors. So the idea that you would like to tease apart what kind of shifts in control you can have during a code switch, right? A sentence. And so that made me, of course, that connected to the work that I published using MRI, looking at the reading of code switch sentences that had either a valid type of code switch or a not valid type of code switch. So, you know, the results, you know, showing that we saw engagement of the typical cognitive control areas for all code switches, with a specific extraditional utilization or tapping into those areas for the code switches that were not supported by everyday use of those types of code switches. So in other words, my question is, how do you think could we tease apart? Because I would really be interested in understanding online in real time what changes throughout the processing of sentences that have code switches of different types. So what is the waxing and waning of certain processes? So I wonder, I mean, I do think we could look at that, looking, for example, at brain oscillations within a sentence and looking at changes in how the oscillatory signal changes to try to understand whether it's more, initially a proactive or reactive control, but and the transition and when and how. I would be happy to hear what you think. And also this is something that would really interest me, because the MRI data were good and nice and very exciting in a way, but really it was this chunk, they read the sentence. I couldn't look at the temporal resolution of that effect. Let me put it that way, very simply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely love that idea. I mean, if you think brain oscillations is the way to do it, sign me up and let's do it, because that would be really nice. I do think there are these two pieces here. And I know other people are thinking about it that way too. And so there's this utility side, it's the Q validity side, and then what happens when you actually get the code switch. And I'm sure that applies for other aspects of language, but I think it would be really helpful to clarify this here. So yeah, I mean, I have nothing else to say other than let's do it. That sounds really great.
Yeah, when I come back home, we can definitely talk about it.
Perfect. Okay.
Sorry, we have one more thing.
So I just asked Alex if I could say something mushy in closing, because I think we're closing up here. So I don't mean to take it away from her because she introduced you, but I just want to say one thing. I really just want to say it because I feel it right now. I first met Jorge many years ago. That I remember, and I'm sure I'd seen him before. And I don't know if you remember Jorge at HLS when we did it in Florida when I was still there. And I remembered him being really, really nice to two of my master's students at the time. And I didn't know who he was, but he was so eloquent and so well-spoken. And he was sitting with somebody I've known for a long time, which is Julie Ducius. And I remember saying to people, who is that guy? He was not only so nice, but so sharp and so smart. And I think at the time you were at UPenn doing a postdoc, if I recall correctly, right? And I have been so interested in all of the stuff that he has done. And he is one of the most eloquent, magnanimous, wonderful thinkers. And I mean this sincerely. And, when I left Florida, I left because I needed to, but also with a heavy heart. And I was so happy when he got the job at Florida. Your work is absolutely amazing. It's just as amazing in what I expected from this young, eloquent person 10 years ago, actually, I think at this point. And it's just so fantastic to watch. So all of you who are young, I mean that so sincerely. This is just a fantastic example of somebody who now is well into the middle part of their career with tenure, as there should be. And it's really just amazing, Jorge. So I just felt, I don't know why, mushy came to my heart and I wanted to say it. So goodbye to you, potentially everybody, unless Alex wants to say something. And yeah.
Oh,
incredible. Thank you, Jason.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much. I have
great stuff. This is fantastic.
I have nothing better to say to that, and that has been my experience with Jorge as well. I think I took your class in my first year. I was like, this guy, I can do the stuff that I'm so interested in with him, and you've been just such an amazing support. And I don't know if I would have finished my PhD if it was somebody else even. So thank you again so much for everything. All right. Okay, I think let's stop it here unless we all start crying, or lest we all start crying. Thank you again for a great talk, and including our work too. That was interesting to hear. And let's close here. Thank you so much for a great discussion, and I'll see you soon.
I hope
all
I
of
get
you.
to visit y'all in Norway next time.
Yes.
That would be wonderful.
Yes,
Thank
do
you,
it.
everyone. I really appreciate it, and see you all in distinct venues soon.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.